In this episode, we're going to take a very practical step that makes everything else easier, which is building fast, reliable recall for the acronyms you will see and hear while studying for the Certified Information Privacy Manager, CIPM, exam. Acronyms are not the core of privacy management, but they are a friction point that can quietly drain your energy because if you stumble over terms, you lose the thread of a question and waste time translating instead of reasoning. Beginners often think the problem is that they do not know enough content, when the real problem is that their vocabulary is slow, and slow vocabulary makes even familiar ideas feel confusing. The goal here is to turn high-yield acronyms into instant recognition so you can focus on what the exam is actually testing, which is program thinking, decision-making, and lifecycle awareness. We'll treat this as an audio reference you can replay, where each acronym gets a plain meaning and a simple mental hook, so you can hear it and immediately know what kind of concept it represents. By the end, you should feel less mental drag when you study, because your brain will stop pausing on letters and start moving smoothly through ideas. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To make this work, it helps to understand why acronyms cause trouble in the first place, because the solution is not just to memorize expansions. When you first learn something, your brain stores it as separate pieces, like letters, full words, and context, and that makes recall slow and fragile. Speed recall happens when those pieces fuse into one chunk. So you hear the acronym and your brain jumps straight to meaning and usage. That chunking process improves when you repeatedly retrieve the meaning and connect it to the type of decision it influences, rather than simply rereading a definition. So for each acronym, we're not aiming for a perfect textbook sentence. We're aiming for a quick internal translation that lets you keep reading a question without losing momentum. Another key point is that acronyms often represent categories of program activity, like assessments, security safeguards, or legal frameworks, and recognizing the category is sometimes more important than reciting the full phrase. If you can hear an acronym and immediately know whether it relates to risk, security, privacy rights, or organizational roles, you will be much more effective under time pressure. This is why an audio-first acronym reference can be powerful, because it trains your brain to recognize patterns by sound. Let's start with acronyms that show up in privacy management across many contexts, because these are foundational for understanding program work. Personally Identifiable Information, PII, is one of the most common, and the key is to treat it as data that can identify a person directly or indirectly in context. The exam often cares less about whether a specific data element is PII in every universe, and more about whether you can recognize when identification is reasonably possible, because that drives obligations and risk. Sensitive PII is not always a separate acronym on its own, but it is a concept that matters because some data types increase harm potential, which influences controls and governance attention. Data Subject Access Request, DSAR, shows up as a common operational reality, and for you it should immediately signal rights handling processes, intake, verification, response timelines, and consistent procedures. Consent Management Platform, CMP, is a phrase you may hear in the broader privacy world, and you do not need tool details, but you should understand that it relates to how consent choices are collected, stored, and honored. When these acronyms appear, the exam is usually pointing you toward practical program controls rather than abstract philosophy. Now let's focus on acronyms that tie privacy work to security thinking, because privacy programs depend on security capabilities even though privacy is not the same as security. Information security, IS, appears often, and you should treat it as the discipline that protects information against unauthorized access, misuse, or loss, which supports privacy goals by reducing exposure and harm. Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, is a role acronym that often appears in organizational contexts, and you should hear it and think security leadership, risk management alignment, and cross-functional partnership. Data Loss Prevention, DLP, is a security control family concept and in privacy, thinking it matters because it can reduce unauthorized leakage of personal data. Incident response, IR, is another common acronym, and you should hear it and think detect, contain, investigate, and learn, because privacy incidents often require coordinated response and communication. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, is a classic example of a security safeguard that supports privacy by reducing unauthorized account access, and it often appears as a straightforward control selection concept. The exam will not expect you to configure these controls, but it will expect you to understand that privacy operations rely on security controls for confidentiality and integrity. Acronyms also show up in the world of risk, assessments, and governance, which is the heart of privacy program management. Privacy Impact Assessment, PIA, and Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA, are frequently discussed, and your mental shortcut should be that both are structured ways to evaluate privacy risks of processing activities and to document mitigations. Different jurisdictions and organizations use different labels, but the core idea is consistent. You are assessing risk before or during processing, not after harm occurs. Risk management, RM, as a concept is often implicit, but you should think of it as identifying, analyzing, treating, and monitoring risk, not just listing scary possibilities. Key Performance Indicator, KPI, is a measurement acronym that helps programs track whether activities are working, and in privacy programs it often ties to training completion, assessment coverage, response timeliness, and policy adherence. Key Risk Indicator, KRI, is closely related but focuses on signals that risk is increasing, such as rising exception rates or repeated incidents. When these measurement acronyms appear, the exam is usually testing whether you understand that programs must be measurable and adaptable, not just well-intentioned. Some acronyms appear around privacy roles and organizational structures, and these matter because CIPM is strongly program-oriented. Data Protection Officer, DPO, is a role that many learners encounter early, and the key is to understand it as a defined privacy leadership and oversight role with independence expectations in certain regulatory contexts. Chief Privacy Officer, CPO, is another leadership role acronym, and you should associate it with leading the privacy program, setting direction, and coordinating across the organization. Human Resources, HR, shows up because employee data is a major processing category, and training and policy enforcement often intersect with people processes. Third-party risk management, TPRM, is a concept area that can appear in privacy contexts because vendors process data and create risk pathways, and it signals diligence, contracting, oversight, and ongoing monitoring. Service Level Agreement, SLA, is a cross-functional concept that can appear in operational contexts, especially when handling requests or incidents, because it relates to expected timelines and quality of service. When role and structure acronyms show up, the exam often wants you to recognize accountability, reporting, and how privacy fits into the organization's operating model. Acronyms also show up in the legal and regulatory space, and while CIPM is not a pure law exam, you need to recognize common frameworks because they shape program obligations. General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is one of the most referenced, and you should hear it and think comprehensive privacy regulation with defined rights, obligations, and governance expectations. California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, is another that appears frequently in conversations, and you should associate it with consumer rights and obligations around disclosure, access, and choices in certain contexts. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, is a sector-specific example, and it signals health information protections and specific rule sets for certain entities. Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI-DSS, shows up mostly in security contexts, but it can intersect with privacy when cardholder data is involved, and your mental model should be that standards can impose operational requirements that affect data handling. When these regulatory acronyms appear, the exam is typically not asking you to cite legal text, but to recognize that different obligations exist and that programs must track and operationalize them through policy and procedure. Another family of acronyms involves data management concepts that directly shape privacy outcomes, because privacy is heavily affected by how data is collected, stored, used, shared, and retained. Data retention, DR, is sometimes discussed without an acronym, but retention schedules and minimization are critical because keeping data longer than needed increases risk and complicates rights handling. Data classification, DC, is a concept that helps organizations apply different protections to different data types, and in privacy it supports consistent handling rules for personal information. Records of processing activities, ROPA, is a term you may encounter in program contexts, and it signals documentation of what data is processed, for what purpose, by whom, and with what safeguards. Data lifecycle management, DLM, is a broad concept, and you should connect it to the idea that privacy must be managed from collection through disposal, not only at storage. When you see these data management acronyms, your brain should move toward operational controls that make privacy manageable, like having inventories, retention rules, and consistent handling practices. This is where privacy management stops being abstract and becomes something the organization can actually run. It is also useful to recognize acronyms that show up in conversations about technology trends, because modern privacy programs must handle changes in data use even if they are not implementing systems directly. Artificial intelligence, AI, is common, and you should associate it with new kinds of data use, automation, and risk around inference, bias, and transparency. Machine learning, ML, is closely related, and it often signals model training, data sets, and the risk of unexpected use or re-identification. Application Programming Interface, API, is a technical acronym that can appear because data often moves through interfaces and privacy controls must consider how data is shared and accessed. Software Development Lifecycle, SDLC, is another, and in privacy program terms it often signals building privacy checkpoints into product development processes, not as an afterthought. Cloud Service Provider, CSP, can appear when discussing third-party processing and shared responsibility thinking. You do not need to become an engineer to understand these, but you should be able to hear them and recognize that they usually point to data flows, third-party involvement, and the need for governance and controls. Now let's talk about how to practice these acronyms so they become speed recall instead of a list you forget. The mistake most people make is to study acronyms in isolation, like flashcards that only ask for the expansion, because that trains you to perform a trivia trick rather than to apply meaning in context. A better method is to practice translating from acronym to category and action, like hearing DPIA and immediately thinking structured privacy risk assessment for processing changes, or hearing DSAR and thinking standardized intake and response process. Another effective practice is to group acronyms by the part of the privacy program lifecycle they connect to, because grouping improves memory and improves test performance. For example, strategy and governance acronyms often relate to roles and accountability, while operations acronyms often relate to request handling, training, monitoring, and incident response. When you practice this way, acronyms become navigation markers in your mental map rather than obstacles. Over time, you will notice that you stop hearing letters and start hearing meaning, which is the real goal. It is also important to avoid overfitting your studying to acronyms, because a surprising number of learners accidentally make acronyms the main event. Acronyms are useful, but they are only the labels on ideas, and the exam is interested in whether you understand and can manage the ideas. If you can expand GDPR perfectly but cannot explain how a privacy program operationalizes obligations through governance and procedures, the acronym knowledge will not save you. Think of acronyms as handles that let you grab a concept quickly, not as the concept itself. The exam will test your ability to recognize when a term implies a program requirement, a risk, or an operational process, and that recognition depends on understanding relationships. So as you practice, always attach an acronym to a plain language explanation and a life cycle stage, because that makes the knowledge usable. This approach also prevents anxiety, because you stop worrying about forgetting a phrase and start trusting that you understand what the acronym represents. As we wrap up, remember that the purpose of this high-yield acronym reference is to reduce friction so your attention stays on program thinking. You want to hear PII and think identifiable person data and risk, hear DPIA and think structured privacy risk evaluation for processing, hear DSAR and think standardized rights request handling, and hear CISO or DPO and immediately think role clarity, and accountability. You also want to recognize that some acronyms pull you toward security safeguards, some toward governance structure, and some toward operational routines, and that recognition helps you answer questions faster. When your acronym recall is quick, you read questions with fewer interruptions, you make better choices under time pressure, and you feel calmer because you are not constantly translating. Keep treating acronyms as reusable mental shortcuts tied to meaning and action, and they will serve you throughout the rest of your studying. The smoother your vocabulary becomes, the more mental space you have for the real work of CIPM, which is understanding how privacy programs succeed in the real world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.